Moving on straight into our next masterclass. So we're going to have this and then go straight to lunch. So some people like letters, some people like numbers, and this is a man who loves his numbers. And his name is Andrew Howe, who last year published the Encyclopedia of the Socceroos and has published this year a World Cup edition of the Encyclopedia of the Matildas. So he is the ultimate statistician for Australian football. Needs no introduction, Andrew Howe.
Thanks for that no introduction, Adrian. Thanks for having me along. What an exciting weekend of football writing festivities. A truly historic week for the national teams, with the Matildas helping kick off the first Senior World Cup played on Australian soil here in Sydney. And after the Socceroos centenary year last year, 2023 marks 100 years since the first full international match played in Australia, when the New Zealand men's national side toured the eastern states. So this major milestone for our national teams is a good opportunity to reflect on the past and how we've grown, both upwards and outwards. In many ways, the 101-year history of our national teams reflects the history of Australia as a nation and paves a path for its future in terms of its population of players and people. 2023 is also a personal milestone for me. The 35 years since watching my first football game. I grew up in the Shire, a very Anglo-Saxon, a very insular part of Sydney. I was a rugby league fan and barely knew a thing about the global game. In 1988, my eyes suddenly opened to the world when I wandered into multicultural inner Western Sydney to watch a soccer game, an Italian derby. Two teams I had barely heard of before, Apia and Marconi, were playing, and there was a buzzing atmosphere I'd never experienced before. I was hooked. So as I started going to more soccer games, I wanted to know more about these clubs, these players, these fans. And uniting these components of the game was a national team whose history I also wanted to know, especially in terms of those players who populated those teams. But that information was hard to find. And so I set about creating my own information. So this quest to quantify the history of football in Australia has subsumed me ever since and complemented my qualifications as a professional population statistician. And so before I knew it, I was the guy for stats on the clubs, the players, this game I was now obsessed with. The national governing body got me on board as their stato in 1999, and one of the early tasks for me was to coordinate the first official caps listing for men's and women's national team players. So as I was collecting the stats, I was collecting their stories, and there are so many stories to tell: where they came from, where they played, and what they achieved. And the stories of the A to Z of Socceroos and Matildas can be told using more than just stats and words. We can tell them using pictures, charts, and in other ways. Thanks to Fair Play Publishing, we can now read the stories of every single senior national team player ever, over 1,200 of them, in the Encyclopedia of Socceroos and the Encyclopedia of Matildas. So, where does Australia's national team history start? Well, we celebrated the centenary of the Socceroos last year, a momentous milestone year for the men's side that ended with a wonderful World Cup performance in Qatar, which means the first men's national team kicked off in 1922, or did it? 18 years earlier, in 1904, there was a New Zealand national side was itching to play against international opposition. So as noted in Burning Ambition, released by Fair Play last year, the Kiwis had no Australian National Association to correspond with. So they sent an invitation to the New South Wales State Association to come and tour New Zealand. The New South Wales body wasn't able to get Queensland or Victoria involved, and so it went it alone. So these 1904 games are considered the birth of the New Zealand national team. So is there an argument then that this Australian side also be regarded as this country's first national team? If these other states weren't attracted to the idea, as Nick and Trevor write in the book, then this New South Wales team was the best available Australian representatives at the time. So is our men's national side really more like 120 years old? In 1922, another Australian representative side travelled across the Tasman to take on New Zealand opposition. So 15 players from New South Wales and Queensland departed Sydney on the MV Ulimaroa, bound for New Zealand, and they wore the blue and maroon for their games against New Zealand, the national teams and some provincial sides. So then why do we regard this team as our first official national team? Well, because the 1923 Commonwealth Football of Australia annual reports tell us it was. So these annual reports, these documents, are the statisticians and the historians' Bibles. They're our fact sheets. Besides, the players from that team were from a range of regions, based in clubs in Sydney, the Hunter, Illawarra, Brisbane, Ipswich, and even Queensland North Coast. It was a wide-ranging and official national selection, and there was a similar makeup of domestic players for the reciprocal New Zealand tour in 1923. So over the next 2 decades, the men's side played representative teams of Canada, England, China, and India, visiting club sides from Czechoslovakia, Palestine. Following the Second World War, new opponents included South Africa, Rhodesia, and high-profile club teams from Europe. Australia entered its first major tournament at the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne. Following international suspension in the early 60s, and with major demographic change occurring across the country, across Australia's population, Australia first attempted to qualify for the FIFA World Cup in 1965, and in its third attempt, the Socceroos qualified for the 1974 World Cup. Development opportunities for the men grew over this time with the creation of a national league in 1977, national youth teams, and some of our best players now playing in the tougher leagues of Europe. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the Socceroos went through many ups and downs against many more new opponents. The team recorded impressive results in friendlies against Argentina, Brazil, and did well at the 1988 Olympics, and came close to World Cup qualification a few times. The men's side entered a long, barren World Cup run to qualify for Germany 2006 in spectacular fashion. Around this time, we joined Asia, and our range of opponents has grown even more. The Socceroos are now on what seems almost certain World Cup qualification every 4 years now, qualifying for its 5th consecutive World Cup, played in Qatar just a few months ago. And they did this in scenes almost on par with John Aloisi's winning penalty kick in 2006. Australia entered the modern era in the mid to late 90s with the birth of representative national women's teams. In 1975, a team based on the country's strongest women's club, St George Budapest, represented Australia at the first Women's Asian Cup in Hong Kong. Finishing third behind Thailand and New Zealand, they were the true pioneers. In 1978, the first women's national side, as formally selected, and from several states from the national championships, played against club-based teams at the Women's Invitational in Taiwan. So with no mention of any women's sides in the national team reports in earlier Australian Soccer Federation annual reports, we find the first ASF documentation of women's teams in its 1979 annual report. So following a rightful mention of the 1975 Australian representative team. Here we see the ASF clarification that this 1978 team was the first full national side. This was written by Australian Women's Soccer Association Honorary Secretary Pat O'Connor, and the status of this 1978 team was reinforced by the Women's Association persistently over following decades in an attempt to avoid confusion. And then in 1979 came the first AWSA-endorsed Australian national team to confront another full national side, Australia tying the 3-match series against New Zealand in Sydney and Brisbane. So from the foundations of these 3 pioneering squads who battled for existence in what was very much a men's sporting world at the time, the women's national team was in full swing. They were building international experience, increasing their pool of players, and maturing quickly. So since that 1975 Asian Cup team played against Thailand, Singapore, New Zealand, Malaysia, our senior women's have come up against over 50 different national teams. In the early days, though, games were less frequent than what they are now. In the absence of World Cups and Olympic Games for women, the Women's World Invitationals through to the 1980s, the late 80s, were the world's leading women's tournaments of the era. So held in Taiwan each time, Australia came up against the likes of the Japanese, Canadian, the US full national sides. Our opponents also included strong club sides who lined up behind the flags of their nations and were labelled by the name of the country they came from in the official tournament, and you can see photos there. So this was an important clarification that was documented by the Australian Women's Association at the time, again to reduce the confusion, playing against full national sides, playing against club sides. And so treating these club-based opponents as full national sides later down the track would create statistical havoc, given our obsession with these so-called A international games. In what was a trial Women's World Cup in China in 1988, Australia beat Brazil 1-0. Through the 90s, new opponents included Argentina, Ghana, Russia, and into the 21st century, we've played the likes of Cook Islands, Mexico, and Uzbekistan. Our latest first-time opponents were Indonesia, Spain, and South Africa. Now, Australia wasn't part of the first Women's World Cup in 1991. There was a 3-team round-robin Oceania qualifying tournament. We were part of Oceania at the time. The winning team would qualify. So Australia and New Zealand swapped 1-0 results in that tournament, meaning that comparative results against Papua New Guinea would determine the qualifying team. So I've got on the screen there the scores and the table from that tournament. So winners New Zealand defeated PNG by a combined 27 goals. So there was a 16-0 and a 11-0 that we've got on the screen, while Australia's goals difference was just 20, with the PNG side improving through the last game of the tournament. So a strengthening side through the tournament, Australia just wasn't able to get those extra 7 goals and missed out on qualification. The 2023 Women's World Cup this year will be the 8th World Cup the Matildas have played in since 1995 in Sweden. And our performances over this time have progressively improved. After losing all games in our first World Cup, we managed a draw at both the 1999 and the 2003 World Cups, both held in the United States. We reached the quarterfinals the following 2 World Cups in China and Germany. And meanwhile, we made the final of the Women's Asian Cup in 2006, and won the Asian title in 2010. We won our first World Cup knockout stage game at the 2015 World Cup in Canada, and almost topped our group in 2019. So following a top 4 placing at the last Olympics in 2021, our expectations are high for Australia-New Zealand 2023. And so with a combined history of almost 150 years, it's combined against national teams from 111 countries, 200 more club sides, and in over 300 different cities and towns across the globe, our men's and women's national sides have a long, colourful and fascinating history with countless stories along the way. 1,230 men and women have represented Australia against international opposition. It took 5 years for the first 100 different players to make at least one appearance, and by 1971, just over 500 players had played. With women's representatives from the mid-70s, the rate of new players peaked in the 1980s, and by 2006, when Australia joined the Asian Confederation, just over 1,000 men and women had taken the field for Australian senior teams. The 1,230th and most recent senior international player was Socceroo Jordan Bosch, who debuted against Ecuador in May, while our most recent women's debutante was Claire Hunt at the Cup of Nations in February. Despite her very recent introduction, Claire is in the current World Cup squad, and you can, of course, read about Claire Hunt and all her teammates, past and present, in the new Encyclopedia of Matildas. So overall, around 2 of every 3 national team players since 1922 were born in Australia. So that's for the men's and women's teams combined, 2 out of every 3. Just under 60% of all Socceroos are Australian born. So they come from a decent range of birthplaces within the country. So this map indicates the players born in each Australian population centre over the 101 years of the men's national team. You can see, for example, that Sydney-born Socceroos outnumber Melbourne-born Socceroos by 2.5 to 1. There's around 185 Sydney-born and around almost 74 Melbourne-born Socceroos, for example. So this means that just over 40% of men's players are born overseas. So that's almost half of our men's players over all this time. And I love looking at how this overall proportion of players born or overseas born Socceroos has changed over the century. And you can see from this chart, which shows this proportion since 1922, how the overseas born really jumped after that post-war migration boom, post-World War II migration boom, the third bar across on the screen. And then it's mostly declined since the 70s. So 10 or 20 years ago, only around 5% of Socceroos were overseas born. So what we were seeing at the turn of the century, this century, is the influence of the second and even third generation of that post-war migration boom. So where parents or grandparents even came from all over the globe. Samoa, India, Mauritius, South Africa, Nigeria, Ukraine, Estonia, Chile, Uruguay, and so on. But then look at the last 7 or 8 years. The percentage of overseas-born Socceroos themselves has suddenly doubled. Almost a third of players used over the past year were born overseas. And this sudden increase of overseas-born Socceroos is in line with a recent increase of Australia's total population born overseas. So the 950 plus men's national team players since 1922 were born in almost 50 different countries, with England and Scotland by far the biggest source nations of overseas-born Socceroos over this time. So in the 1920s and 30s, Great Britain and Ireland were the main source countries of our overseas-born men's players, with a handful of other countries represented. In the 1940s and 50s, World War II and its aftermath had great implications for Australia as a nation. The country grew both upwards and outwards on the back of large-scale migration from all over Europe. And suddenly, the Australian men's team also took on a new complexion. Players from all over Europe were making it to the top level in their newly adopted country. And since then, we've had players originally from all parts of the globe play for the Socceroos, especially those born in Africa and Egypt in more recent years. So born in Europe and Africa over the last handful of years. So England, Scotland, Croatia, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, and so on. So this very latest collection of very latest birth countries, the very latest birth countries were Uruguay, South Sudan, and France, with Bruno Fornaroli, Ron Tonic, and Dennis Gendreau born in those countries. So the diversity of the most recent Socceroos is incredible. Now, in the Encyclopedia of Socceroos, there's this cool birthplace analysis page where you can have a look at all these features about our overseas born, or Australian and overseas born Socceroos, including charts of that proportion of overseas born over time and by region, by source region. Okay, what's quite distinct between the men's and the women's national teams is the prominence of the overseas born players. So overall, I mentioned before, just over 40% of all men's players were born overseas. This compares with only 11% of women's team players. And this high proportion of men's players born overseas isn't just because their history is longer. So when we considered just the men's players since the mid-70s, the last, say, 50 years, we still have 27% of Socceroos born overseas, compared to, as I mentioned, around 1 in 10 women's team players. So this clearly means that the vast majority of women's team players were born in Australia. So to analyse this domestic distribution of women's team players, what I've done is I've assigned each or all players to a region within Australia. So based on where they were raised or where they first settled after arriving from overseas. So it's not a fully robust classification for each player, but it should still give us a good indication of the regional distribution of women's team players overall and over time. And what's immediate, apparently, from a map I've got on the screen, is the wide distribution of women's team players across our populated areas. The 270 plus women's representative players come from all parts of the country, including lots from regional Australia, outside of the capitals. So no one region owns the Matildas, they never have. Western Australia is the state of origin of 17 women's representatives, including Lisa Devanna and key current players Sam Kerr and Lydia Williams. The West was also prominent in the early years, with almost half of that first, what we'll call multi-region Australian squad in 1978 coming from WA. Sarah Cooper was a big-name player from the 80s. She was born in Darwin, while there were 4 Alice Springs-based women who played in the late 80s and early 90s. Around 1 in 10 players are from South Australia, including superstar Diane Allegich and World Cup squad members Alex Chidiac and Charlotte Grant. Tasmania's home to just a couple of Matildas, while around 20 players grew up in Victoria, including current players Steph Catley from Melbourne, Tegan Mika from Moe, and Kyra Cooney-Cross, who spent some of her teenage years in Ballarat. The New South Wales map is really interesting. You can see how players are from all parts of the state and Canberra, Queanbeyan region, including current sensations Ellie Carpenter and Claire Hunt, both from the tiny town of Cowra. From Wollongong, we have players such as Julie Porter, Michelle Heyman, Caitlin Ford. Sydney, Australia's biggest city, of course, features prominently. In fact, around a quarter of Matildas grew up or first settled from overseas in Sydney, including all 3 pioneering captains, Pat O'Connor, Connie Burns and Julie Dolan. There's also Anissa Tan, Sarah Walsh, Alana Kennedy, the Sydney list goes on. Around 1 in 8 players are from northern New South Wales, including appearance record holder Cheryl Salisbury, Australia's first Asian Player of the Year Kate Gill, and World Cup stalwart Emily Van Egmond, And even little Warhope has produced 3 Matildas. Further up the coast, Lismore's Lisa Casagrande played her 64th and last game for Australia, aged just 23. More than 40 Matildas have come from the south-east of Queensland over the past 48 years, including Sue Monteith, Alicia Ferguson and Claire Polkinghorne. Another dozen players are from central and far north Queensland, including current starlet Mary Fowler, originally from Cairns. So Newcastle's Cheryl Salisbury has played the most Australian national team games of anyone. So Cheryl's 171 appearances, including 151 against full national teams, is the highest of any Australian women or men's national team player. So Salisbury played against 49 different opponents in 142 different cities across 24 countries over a 15-year career. The encyclopedias present all the record holders in huge appendices of tables and stats, and so in the Encyclopedia of Matildas, we also find Australia's leading goal scorer and megastar Sam Kerr, originally from Perth, the goalkeeper with the most clean sheets, Melissa Barbieri from Melbourne, the youngest player, Claire Nichols from Brisbane, just 14 years and 5 months old when she made her Matildas debut. While the first captain of an Australian women's representative team is, of course, Pat O'Connor, who originally settled in Sydney after arriving from the UK. So this list of five major record holders who come from 5 different population centres highlights this geographic diversity of the Australian women's sides. So when we look at the contribution of the mostly male overseas-born players over time, and combined with this where our men's and women's representatives have come from within Australia, the history of the national teams in many ways reflects the history of Australia in terms of its migration and settlement patterns. Our most recent Socceroos and Matildas are in many ways a microcosm of Australia as a nation, which now has almost half of its residents or their parents born in any of 200 other countries. And with a population spread over mostly urban but some rural areas across a vast nation of 8 states and territories. There are, however, dimensions of the game where I wouldn't say the national teams reflect broader Australia. While I've mentioned that beautiful broad range of source countries of our most recent overseas-born players and population, we don't see many faces out of our current our biggest overseas arrivals group, the Southern and Eastern Asian nations from China, Southeast Asia, and the subcontinent. I'll speed up a little bit. Another underrepresented demographic are those from the more regional parts of Australia. So while Cowra's Carpenter, Moe's Mika, and Mary Fowler from far north Queensland help give our women's sides that regional spread, similar to the Australian population, our men's team are still relatively underrepresented by players raised in the capitals. And for both the men's and women's teams, players from Sydney are overrepresented compared to overall population. Indigenous Australians are also historically underrepresented in our national teams. While there's no way I know the Indigenous status of all 1,200 plus representative players, my current estimate of 14 players, 7 women, 7 men's, is still only 1% of all players, or the latest Australian census tells us that just over 3% of the Australian population are of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin. Okay, clubs. The Socceroos and Matildas encyclopedias also document which clubs our representatives play for while representing Australia. So on the men's side, the smallest city I found a player at when he played for Australia was Mapleton, a tiny town in the Sunshine Coast hinterland. This is where Wilf Bratton was when he was with the very first Australian side in 1922. Bratton worked as a farmhand in Mapleton, whose population at the time was 381. He played for Australia just 4 years after being gassed and suffering severe trench fever on the Western Front in World War I. In 1988, Jim Patikas became the first overseas-based player when selected to play for the Socceroos. He was at AEK Athens when he played in an Olympics qualifier in Adelaide. Trying to speed up. In 1989, Chelsea player David Mitchell became the first of many selected for Australia while based in England. Europe has, of course, become a popular destination since men's trailblazers such as Patikas and Mitchell, and Aurelio Vidmar, who was Belgium's top scorer in '95 with Standard Liège. In the early 1990s, in the 1990s and early 2000s, Asian clubs became prominent for Socceroos, especially China, Korea, and Japan in the northeast. Sasha Okhanovsky was based in Korea when he became the first Australian man to win the Asian Footballer of the Year in 2010. My movie stopped. Since then, we've had David Carney in Uzbekistan. There we go. In Central Asia when he played for Australia, and the Middle East has also become prominent, starting with Tony Popovich in 2006. Tim Cahill was the first North American-based player to play for the Socceroos. Overall, of course, though, it is Australian clubs where most Socceroos have played while representing their country. So based on the club that each player was at when they made their Socceroo appearance, it's Marconi here in Sydney, followed by St George Budapest, and then South Melbourne Hellas, which has contributed the most men's national team players. I can explain those calculations later if anyone wants to know. Okay, on the women's side, it's fair to say that the A-League Women has helped the Matildas improve its international ranking over the past 15 years. There was, however, a Women's National League before the W League started in 2008. The Encyclopedia of Matildas presents a 34-page summary of Australia's national women's football competitions and all its Matildas players. There's also a rundown of the old national championships, which were the precursor tournaments to National League football. And yeah, there's even more in the Encyclopedia of Matildas than just the player biographies. There are bios for all coaches, a timeline of the team, age analysis, FIFA rankings, lots of fun stuff in there. So yeah, this new Encyclopedia of Matildas is the first major update from the initial edition that Greg Werner and I wrote 4 years ago. And what you'll see I've done with the stats is to reduce this distinction between players who played in A internationals and those who played in all internationals. So it's something I did for the latest addition to the Socceroos Encyclopedia as well. It's a distinction that I'll continue to downplay. You know, you put on the green and gold, you represent Australia against international opposition. I now count you in my stats and in our encyclopedias. From A to Z, from Christia Bentham to Gundy Zarens. So thank you so much, Benita and Fair Play Publishing, for letting me publish all these wonderful player stories and stats in the Encyclopedia of Socceroos and the Encyclopedia of Matildas. Thank you, Greg Werner, for all your work with the Matildas book. It's a beautiful publication. I just love how it looks. And I'm really looking forward to getting it out there in the hands of the fans, especially over upcoming momentous weeks. So thank you, Football Writers Festival, for having me, and thank you all for tuning in.